In the heart of a busy city, where life never seemed to slow down, something happened that would shake the community to its core. It was a humid summer evening, and the streets buzzed with people rushing home after long days at work. Among them was a man who had spent most of his adult life protecting this very city. He was a high-ranking officer in the police department, someone who had earned respect not just within the force but also among the citizens he served. This officer, let's call him the detective, had just finished pulling a double shift. He was tired, hungry, and ready to unwind. Dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie, because sometimes even cops need comfort, he pulled into a convenience store parking lot to grab some food before heading home. Little did he know this simple stop would turn his world upside down. As he stepped out of his car, another figure appeared on the scene. This was no ordinary patrolman. It was a rookie cop known for his aggressive attitude and questionable judgment. Let's refer to him as Officer Rookie. Officer Rookie had been tipped off by a vague call about a suspicious person, matching the detective's description hanging around the area. Without taking a moment to think or assess the situation properly, Officer Rookie marched straight toward the parked car, his demeanor already confrontational. When the detective noticed the uniformed officer approaching, he assumed it was routine, a quick check, maybe asking if everything was okay. But instead of introducing himself calmly or explaining why he was there, Officer Rookie barked orders, demanding the detective step out of his vehicle immediately. The tone was harsh, almost accusatory. Anyone watching could sense the tension building between the two men. Confused but compliant, the detective tried to explain who he was. "I'm one of you," he said, reaching for his badge clipped to his belt. But Officer Rookie wasn't having any of it. He ignored the badge entirely, dismissing the detective's words as irrelevant. Instead, he kept insisting the man follow instructions without question. The detective, now growing frustrated, raised his voice slightly, pointing out that he was a senior officer and deserved basic respect. But Officer Rookie didn't listen. His mind seemed made up. Whether it was because of arrogance, fear, or something else entirely, he refused to acknowledge the truth standing right in front of him. Within moments, things escalated further. Against all protocol and common sense, Officer Rookie slapped handcuffs onto the detective, treating him like a criminal rather than a fellow law enforcer. People passing by couldn't believe what they were seeing. Some stopped to watch, while others pulled out their phones to record the shocking scene unfolding before them. There was the detective, a well-known figure in the community, being humiliated in broad daylight. His protests fell on deaf ears as Officer Rookie dragged him toward a patrol car, ignoring every attempt to clarify the misunderstanding. By the time the detective was shoved into the back seat, videos of the incident were already spreading online. Social media lit up with outrage. Comments poured in from locals who recognized the detective and knew how absurd the situation was. Hashtags like "Respect Our Heroes" and "Cheer Justice" for the detective started trending, drawing attention not only locally, but across the country. What made matters worse was that no one at the precinct seemed aware of what was happening. By the time the detective arrived at the station, locked in a holding cell, the story had exploded far beyond anything anyone could have anticipated. Calls flooded the police department, demanding answers. Community leaders demanded an explanation for how such a grave mistake could happen. Meanwhile, the detective sat alone in the cold, sterile cell, replaying the events in his head. How had this happened? Why hadn't Officer Rookie checked his credentials? And most importantly, when would someone realize the colossal error and set things right? Hours passed before higher-ranking officials finally intervened. Once they confirmed the detective's identity, apologies came quickly, but they felt hollow. The damage had been done. For the first time in his career, the detective felt betrayed, not just by one reckless rookie, but by the system he dedicated his life to, serving. As he walked out of the precinct later that night, surrounded by flashing cameras and reporters shouting questions, he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Little did anyone know, the fallout from this single evening would ripple through the city for days, weeks, and months to come. Lives would change, reputations would crumble, and lessons, painful ones, would be learned. But for now, the detective stood tall, determined to fight back against the injustice he'd faced. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been wronged simply because someone refused to see them for who they truly were. By the time the sun rose over the city, the video of the wrongful detention had gone viral. Social media platforms were flooded with clips of the incident, each one showing the same gut-wrenching scene. A respected officer being treated like a criminal in front of dozens of witnesses. The hashtags, Justice for the Detective and Honoring End Police Misconduct, dominated Twitter and Instagram feeds. People from all walks of life, ordinary citizens, activists, journalists, and even politicians, were talking about what had happened. The outrage was palpable, and it wasn't just limited to online discussions. Local news channels picked up the story almost immediately. Morning shows featured heated debates between anchors, community leaders, and legal experts. One anchor summed it up perfectly. This isn't just a case of mistaken identity. This is a glaring example of how systemic issues can lead to devastating consequences. Calls poured into the police department from concerned residents demanding answers. Protesters began gathering outside police headquarters, holding signs that read, "Accountability now," and "Respect our heroes." At the center of this storm was the detective himself. After spending hours locked in a holding cell, a place he'd never expected to find himself in, he was finally released late the previous night. But freedom didn't bring relief. If anything, it made him angrier. He couldn't shake off the feeling of betrayal. For years, he had worn the badge with pride, risking his life to protect others. And now, because of one reckless rookie cop, his dignity had been stripped away in front of the entire world. Early the next morning, the detective met with his union representatives and a team of civil rights attorneys. They sat together in a small conference room at a downtown law firm, strategizing their next move. The detective's hands trembled as he recounted the events of the previous evening. His voice cracked when he talked about how powerless he felt during the confrontation. "I've spent my whole career building trust in this community," he said, his eyes welling up with tears. "And now, I don't know if I can look people in the eye anymore without thinking about what happened." His attorney, a seasoned lawyer known for taking on high-profile cases, listened intently. She nodded sympathetically before speaking. "This isn't just about you," she said firmly. "This is about sending a message. What happened to you should never happen to anyone else. We're going to make sure justice is served, not just for you, but for everyone who has ever been wronged by someone abusing their power." Later that day, the detective held a press conference. Flanked by his legal team and union reps, he stood behind a podium, facing a sea of cameras and reporters. The room buzzed with anticipation. When he began speaking, his voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Last night, I experienced firsthand what so many members of our community have faced for years," he said. "I was profiled, disrespected, and humiliated, all because someone refused to see me for who I am." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But this isn't just about me. It's about every person who has been treated unfairly because of their race, their clothes, or where they come from. It's about holding those responsible accountable, not just today, but every day moving forward." The crowd erupted into applause, and chants of justice echoed through the room. While the detective was making headlines, the rookie cop involved in the incident, let's call him Officer Rookie, was blissfully unaware of the chaos brewing around him. That morning, he woke up like any other day, got dressed in his uniform, and headed to work. He hadn't seen the videos circulating online or heard the angry voices calling for his head. To him, last night's arrest was just another routine, stop gone slightly wrong. When he arrived at the precinct, something felt off. The usual banter among colleagues was missing. Instead, whispers followed him down the hallways. Some officers avoided eye contact altogether, while others shot him cold, disapproving stares. In the break room, a group of detectives huddled around a TV, watching footage of the detective's press conference. Officer Rookie walked in, hoping to grab a cup of coffee, but the room fell silent the moment he entered. He cleared his throat. awkwardly muttered a quick morning and left without touching the coffee pot. By lunchtime, the tension became unbearable. Two internal affairs investigators showed up at the precinct asking to speak with Officer Rookie. Word spread quickly, and soon everyone knew why they were there. Officer Rookie tried to play it cool, insisting he had done nothing wrong. It was just a misunderstanding, he told his partner, who gave him a skeptical look. I was doing my job. But deep down, Officer Rookie must have sensed that things weren't going to end well for him. As he sat in Chief Monroe's office, later that afternoon, surrounded by stern-faced investigators, his confidence began to waver. They grilled him about the events of the previous night, asking detailed questions about his decision-making process. Why hadn't he verified the man's credentials? Did he recognize the badge when it was shown to him? Had he considered the possibility that he might be detaining a fellow officer? Officer Rookie stumbled over his answers, his excuses sounding weaker with each passing minute. By the time the meeting ended, sweat dripped from his forehead, and his hands trembled as he signed the official statement. The investigators left the room, leaving Officer Rookie alone with Chief Monroe. She didn't say much, but her expression said it all. This wasn't going to blow over anytime soon. As Officer Rookie drove home that evening, his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Notifications poured in from social media apps, emails, and text messages. At first, he ignored them, assuming they were updates from friends or colleagues. But curiosity got the better of him, and he finally glanced at his screen. What he saw made his stomach drop. Hundreds of messages filled his inbox, most of them hateful. Strangers called him names, accused him of racism, and threatened retaliation. Videos of the detective's press conference popped up everywhere he looked, reminding him of the role he played in ruining another person's life. Panicked, Officer Rookie parked his car on the side of the road and scrolled through the comments. Each one felt like a punch to the gut. How could you do this? One read. You've disgraced the badge, said another. Some messages included screenshots of past complaints filed against him, accusations of racial profiling and excessive force that had been swept under the rug until now. For the first time, Officer Rookie realized the weight of his actions. Back at home, he locked the doors, closed the blinds, and turned off the lights. Sitting alone in the dark, he replayed the events of the previous night in his mind. He thought about the detective's face, the way he pleaded for understanding, and how he had ignored it all. Guilt gnawed at him, but so did fear. Fear of losing his job, fear of becoming a pariah, and fear of what might happen next. Meanwhile, the city continued to react. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters, chanting slogans and demanding accountability. Local leaders called emergency meetings to discuss reforms within the department. Journalists dug deeper into Officer Rookie's background, uncovering troubling patterns of behavior that painted a damning picture. The pressure mounted, and everyone knew the fallout was only beginning. For the detective, the fight was far from over. While he appreciated the support pouring in from the community, he couldn't ignore the pain he still carried. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw the humiliation etched on his face. But he also saw determination to ensure that no one else would have to endure what he went through. Little did he know the coming days would test his resolve in ways he couldn't imagine. The next morning, the city woke up to a different kind of tension. The air felt heavier, charged with emotions that ranged from anger to sadness to frustration. People were talking about one thing and one thing only: the wrongful detention of the senior officer by a rookie cop who had acted recklessly. Social media continued to buzz with outrage, but now it wasn't just ordinary citizens chiming in. Journalists, activists, and even politicians joined the conversation, demanding answers and accountability. At police headquarters, things were chaotic. Reporters camped outside the building, shoving microphones toward anyone who dared step out. Inside, officers whispered nervously in hallways, unsure of what would happen next. The internal affairs team worked tirelessly, reviewing every detail of the incident. Surveillance footage from the convenience store, witness statements, and body cam recordings were all being analyzed. Each piece of evidence painted the same picture: a reckless rookie ignoring protocol, failing to verify credentials, and escalating a situation that never should have happened. For the detective, the day began early. After a sleepless night spent replaying the events in his mind, he decided to focus on what mattered most: fighting for justice. He met again with his legal team and union representatives, discussing their strategy moving forward. They knew this case was bigger than just him. It represented an opportunity to push for real change within the department. But they also warned him that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, backlash, and attempts to downplay what had happened. Later that afternoon, Chief Monroe called an emergency meeting with her command staff. The room was tense as everyone took their seats around the large conference table. Some officers avoided eye contact while others exchanged worried glances. Chief Monroe stood at the head of the table, her expression unreadable. She started by acknowledging the gravity of the situation. "What happened last night isn't just a stain on our department," she said sternly. "It's a wake-up call. We need to address this head-on, or we risk losing the trust of the community we swore to protect." One by one, members of the command staff shared their thoughts. Some argued for leniency toward Officer Rookie, pointing out that he was still new to the job and likely didn't fully understand the consequences of his actions. Others insisted that leniency wasn't an option, not this time. "This isn't just about one bad decision," one senior officer said firmly. "This is about years of complacency. If we don't hold him accountable, we're sending a message. That misconduct will always be swept under the rug." Chief Monroe listened carefully before making her decision. She announced that Officer Rookie would be suspended indefinitely, pending further investigation. Additionally, she ordered an external review of the department's training programs, promising transparency and accountability. While these measures were necessary, they weren't enough to quell the growing unrest outside the precinct. Meanwhile, Officer Rookie was grappling with the fallout. By midday, news of his suspension had leaked, spreading like wildfire across social media. People reacted harshly, calling for more severe punishment. Protesters gathered outside his home, holding signs that read, "No more excuses," and "Accountability starts here." Friends and family distanced themselves, unwilling to face the backlash. Even his colleagues at the precinct avoided him, whispering behind his back about how he had brought shame to the badge. That evening, Officer Rookie sat alone in his apartment, staring blankly at the wall. His phone buzzed constantly with hateful messages, each one more vicious than the last. He tried to block users, delete apps, and turn off notifications, but it didn't help. Everywhere he looked, he saw reminders of what he had done. Sleep eluded him as guilt and fear consumed his thoughts. For the first time, he realized the enormity of his mistake. Back at the detective's house, the mood was equally somber. Despite the public support he was receiving, he couldn't shake off the weight of what had happened. Every knock on the door made him flinch, wondering if someone else wanted to confront him or criticize him. He thought about the countless times he had gone above and beyond to serve his community, only to be treated like a criminal because of someone else's carelessness. It stung deeply, leaving scars that wouldn't heal anytime soon. But amidst the pain, there was also purpose. The detective knew he had a chance to make a difference, to turn this tragedy into something meaningful. That evening, he sat down with his wife and kids, explaining why he wanted to fight not just for himself, but for others who had been wronged. "If I can use my voice to create change," he told them, "then maybe none of this will have been in vain." His family nodded, offering their support despite knowing the challenges ahead. As the days wore on, the pressure mounted. Community. Leaders organized rallies, drawing thousands of people to the streets. Speakers shared stories of similar injustices, highlighting systemic issues within law enforcement. Activists called for reforms, including better training, stricter accountability measures, and greater representation of minorities in leadership roles. Local politicians promised action, introducing bills aimed at increasing oversight of police departments. Inside the precinct, tensions ran high. Officers debated among themselves, some defending Officer Rookie, while others condemned him. Morale plummeted as trust between colleagues eroded. Chief Monroe struggled to maintain order, issuing memos reminding everyone of their duty to uphold integrity and professionalism. But no amount of paperwork could repair the damage done. By the end of the week, the internal affairs investigators submitted their findings to Chief Monroe. Their report was damning, detailing numerous violations of protocol committed by Officer Rookie. They recommended disciplinary action, including termination and potential criminal charges depending on the outcome of external probes. Chief Monroe reviewed the document late into the night, her mind racing with the implications. She knew whatever decision she made would define her tenure as chief, and possibly the future of the department itself. For the detective, the waiting game was excruciating. He attended meetings, gave interviews, and participated in discussions about reform. But nothing could distract him from the uncertainty looming over his case. Would Officer Rookie face consequences? Would the department implement meaningful changes? Or would everything fade away once the headlines stopped? Despite the chaos, the detective remained resolute. He refused to let bitterness consume him, choosing instead to channel his energy into advocacy. He visited schools, spoke at community events, and mentored young recruits, emphasizing the importance of empathy, respect, and accountability. Slowly but surely, he began to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. Officer Rookie, on the other hand, found himself increasingly isolated, suspended without pay, ostracized by colleagues, and vilified by the public. He struggled to find redemption. Some nights he considered reaching out to the detective to apologize, but fear held him back. What could he possibly say to make amends? And would the detective even listen? As the city braced for what came next, one thing was clear. This incident had changed everything. It exposed cracks in the system, forced difficult conversations, and left lasting impacts on everyone involved. Whether it led to true reform or merely temporary fixes remained to be seen. But for now, the fight for justice and healing was far from over. The days following the incident felt like an eternity for everyone involved. The city was still buzzing with outrage, and the pressure on the police department to take action was mounting by the hour. Protesters gathered daily outside the precinct, their chants echoing through the streets. "Justice for the detective," they shouted, holding signs that read, "Accountability now," and "Protect our heroes." The community's anger wasn't just directed at Officer Rookie, it was aimed at a system that had allowed such a grave mistake to happen in the first place. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officers walked around with their heads down, avoiding eye contact with each other. Conversations were hushed, and you could feel the weight of judgment hanging over everyone. Some officers defended Officer Rookie, insisting he was simply inexperienced and made a costly error. Others openly criticized him, saying his actions reflected poorly on the entire force. Morale was at an all-time low, and Chief Monroe knew she had to act quickly before things spiraled further out of control. Finally, the day came when Officer Rookie was summoned to appear before Chief Monroe. He arrived at her office that morning, dressed in his uniform but looking anything but confident. His hands trembled as he adjusted his cap, and beads of sweat formed on his forehead despite the air conditioning. When he stepped inside, he found himself facing not only Chief Monroe but also a group of senior officers and internal affairs investigators. Their expressions were stern, unreadable, and utterly intimidating. Chief Monroe wasted no time getting to the point. She laid out the findings of the investigation in clear, unflinching terms. Surveillance footage from the convenience store confirmed the detective's version of events. Officer Rookie had approached aggressively, ignored the badge presented to him, and escalated the situation unnecessarily. Witnesses corroborated the account describing how the detective repeatedly tried to explain who he was, only to be dismissed. Body cam footage revealed even more damning details. Officer Rookie hadn't followed proper protocol, failed to identify himself clearly, and showed blatant disregard for basic procedures. As Chief Monroe spoke, Officer Rookie shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His face turned red and his voice cracked when he tried to defend himself. "I thought I was doing my job," he stammered. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." But his excuses fell flat. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and there was no denying the gravity of his mistakes. Chief Monroe cut him off mid-sentence. "Your intentions don't matter here," she said firmly. "What matters is the impact of your actions. You humiliated a respected officer in front of the entire community. You damaged public trust in this department, and you ignored every rule we have in place to prevent exactly this kind of disaster." With that, she delivered the verdict. Officer Rookie was suspended indefinitely, pending further review. Depending on the outcome of external investigations, criminal charges could follow. The room fell silent as the reality sank in. For Officer Rookie, it was a moment of reckoning he couldn't escape. He nodded numbly, unable to meet anyone's gaze, and left the office without another word. Later that evening, Officer Rookie drove home alone, replaying the meeting in his mind. Every word Chief Monroe had said echoed in his ears, haunting him. He pulled into his driveway, parked the car, and sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, but he didn't dare check them. He already knew what awaited him, a barrage of hateful messages, threats, and insults. Social media had become a minefield, and stepping into it felt like walking into a storm. When he finally mustered the courage to go inside, he locked the doors behind him and drew the curtains shut. The house felt eerily quiet, amplifying the chaos in his mind. He poured himself a drink, hoping it would calm his nerves, but it did little to ease the guilt gnawing at him. He kept thinking about the detective, the look of disbelief and humiliation on his face, the way he pleaded for understanding, and how Officer Rookie had ignored it all. For the first time, he allowed himself to truly reflect on what he had done. It wasn't just about one bad decision, it was about years of unchecked behavior. He remembered past complaints filed against him, accusations of racial profiling, excessive force, and poor judgment, all of which had been brushed aside or dismissed entirely. At the time, he had convinced himself that those incidents weren't serious, that he was just doing his job. But now, faced with the consequences of his actions, he realized how wrong he had been. That night, sleep eluded him. He tossed and turned, plagued by nightmares of angry crowds, flashing cameras, and the detective's piercing gaze. By morning, he looked pale and gaunt, shadows under his eyes betraying his lack of rest. Friends and family stopped calling, unwilling to associate themselves with someone embroiled in such controversy. Even his neighbors avoided him, casting wary glances whenever he stepped outside. Isolation became his constant companion. Meanwhile, the detective was navigating his own challenges. While he appreciated the outpouring of support from the community, he couldn't ignore the emotional toll the incident had taken on him. Every time he put on his uniform, he felt a pang of unease, wondering if people saw him differently now. Would they question his authority? Would they doubt his integrity? These thoughts lingered in the back of his mind, making it hard to focus on work. But the detective refused to let bitterness consume him. Instead, he channeled his energy into advocacy. He attended town hall meetings, spoke at rallies, and met with community leaders to discuss ways to improve policing practices. He emphasized the importance of accountability, empathy, and transparency, urging both officers and citizens to work together toward meaningful change. His speeches resonated deeply with audiences, earning him standing ovations and renewed respect. One evening, after a particularly powerful speech, a young woman approached him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "You're giving us hope when we needed it most." Her words touched him deeply, reminding him why he had chosen this path in the first place. He smiled warmly, patting her shoulder. "We're going to get through this," he assured her. Together. Back at the precinct, reforms were slowly taking shape. Chief Monroe implemented new training programs focused on de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity, and implicit bias recognition. She invited civil rights advocates and community leaders to lead workshops, ensuring that officers understood the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. Though some officers grumbled about the changes, many welcomed them, recognizing the need for improvement. Despite these efforts, tensions remained high. Trust between the department and the community was fragile, and rebuilding it would take time. Protesters continued to gather outside the precinct, demanding justice and transparency. Journalists dug deeper into Officer Rookie's past, uncovering troubling patterns that painted a damning picture. Public pressure mounted, leaving no room for complacency. For Officer Rookie, life became increasingly unbearable. Suspended without pay, ostracized by colleagues, and vilified by the public, he struggled to find redemption. Some nights, he considered reaching out to the detective to apologize, but fear held him back. What could he possibly say to make amends? And would the detective even listen? As the weeks passed, the city braced itself for what came next. Would Officer Rookie face criminal charges? Would the department implement lasting reforms? Or would everything fade away once the headlines stopped? One thing was certain. This incident had changed everything. It exposed cracks in the system, forced difficult conversations, and left lasting impacts on everyone involved. Whether it led to true reform or merely temporary fixes remained to be seen. But for now, the fight for justice and healing was far from over. Months had passed since the incident, but its ripple effects continued to shape the city. Life had changed for everyone involved, the detective, Officer Rookie, and even the community at large. The streets still buzzed with conversations about accountability, reform, and trust. While some wounds had begun to heal, others remained raw and open, a constant reminder of how fragile relationships between law enforcement and citizens could be. For the detective, life was slowly returning to a semblance of normalcy. He had thrown himself into advocacy work, becoming a voice for change within the department and beyond. His days were filled with meetings, speeches, and workshops aimed at bridging the gap between officers and the communities they served. Yet despite his outward determination, there were moments when he felt the weight of everything that had happened. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the world seemed to pause, he would sit by the window, staring out at the darkened streets. Memories of that fateful evening still lingered, flashes of handcuffs clicking shut, the cold stares of bystanders, and the sinking feeling of helplessness. But instead of letting bitterness consume him, he reminded himself why he was fighting. Not just for himself, but for everyone who deserved better. One day, the detective found himself standing on stage at a national conference focused on policing reform. The room was packed with attendees, officers, activists, politicians, and everyday citizens, all eager to hear what he had to say. As he looked out at the sea of faces, he took a deep breath and began speaking. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated event," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "It was a symptom of larger issues we've ignored for too long. Issues like bias, lack of accountability, and broken trust." He went on to share his story, recounting the humiliation of being detained, the outrage that followed, and the lessons he'd learned along the way. His words resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom nodded in agreement or wiped away tears. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. People lined up afterward to thank him, shaking his hand and sharing their own experiences of injustice. For the first time in months, the detective felt a glimmer of hope, not because of the praise, but because he saw people genuinely committed to creating change. Meanwhile, Officer Rookie's life had taken a drastically different turn. After his suspension, he disappeared from public view, retreating into isolation. Unable to find work elsewhere due to the stigma surrounding his actions, he struggled financially and emotionally. Friends stopped calling, family distanced themselves, and strangers continued to vilify him online. Each day felt heavier than the last, as if the walls of his small apartment were closing in on him. But one evening, something unexpected happened. As Officer Rookie loaded boxes into a moving truck outside his building, preparing to leave the city and start over somewhere new, he noticed someone approaching him. It was the detective. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Officer Rookie hesitated, lowering the box in his hands. "Detective," he began, his voice trembling. I wanted to apologize. What I did was wrong. I hope someday you can forgive me." The words came out rushed, almost desperate. He stood there, pale and gaunt, waiting for a response. The detective studied him carefully, his expression unreadable. There was no anger in his gaze, only a deep sense of reflection. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Apologies are easy," he said, his tone measured but firm. "Change is hard. If you're serious about making amends, start there." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Officer Rookie standing alone amidst the crowd of movers and passers-by. Those few sentences left Officer Rookie reeling. They weren't harsh, but they carried a weight that hit him harder than any insult ever could. For the first time, he realized that saying sorry wasn't enough. True redemption required action, real, tangible steps toward growth and accountability. That night, as he drove away from the city, he couldn't stop thinking about the detective's words. Was it possible to rebuild his life? Could he ever earn back the trust he had lost? He didn't have answers yet, but for the first time in months, he felt a flicker of resolve. Back in the city, changes were beginning to take root. Under Chief Monroe's leadership, the police department implemented sweeping reforms. Officers were required to undergo rigorous training programs focused on de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and recognizing implicit biases. Civil rights. Advocates led workshops, sharing personal stories and challenging officers to see things from different perspectives. Community members were invited to participate in discussions, offering feedback and holding the department accountable. These efforts weren't without resistance. Some officers grumbled about the extra workload, while others dismissed the training as unnecessary. But many embraced the changes, recognizing the importance of rebuilding trust. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere within the precinct shifted. Conversations became more open, and collaboration between officers and citizens improved. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, a step in the right direction. The community also played a crucial role in driving change. Activists organized rallies, town halls, and educational events, keeping the conversation alive. Local leaders introduced legislation aimed at increasing oversight of law enforcement agencies, ensuring transparency and accountability. Journalists continued to investigate systemic issues, shining a light on areas that needed improvement. Together, these efforts created a groundswell of momentum, pushing the city toward a brighter future. For the detective, seeing these changes unfold brought a sense of fulfillment. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but he believed in the power of persistence. One afternoon, as he walked through the precinct parking lot, he spotted Officer Rookie loading boxes into a moving truck. Their eyes met briefly before Officer Rookie hurried away, head bowed. It was a quiet moment, devoid of confrontation but filled with unspoken consequences. Though the two men never crossed paths again, their lives remained intertwined by the lessons they had learned. For the detective, the journey had become less about vengeance and more about paving a better path forward, for himself, his community, and perhaps even the flawed system they all shared. And for Officer Rookie, the road to redemption was just beginning, marked by uncertainty but also the possibility of transformation. As the sun set over the city, casting golden hues across the skyline, the echoes of the past mingled with the promise of tomorrow. The fight for justice wasn't over, but it had evolved, shifting from anger to action, from division to unity. In the end, it wasn't about blame or punishment. It was about learning, growing, and striving to do better. Because sometimes the hardest battles lead to the most meaningful victories. The months that followed the incident brought a mix of progress and lingering questions. The city, once divided by anger and mistrust, was slowly finding its footing again. But healing wasn't linear. It came in waves, with moments of hope, overshadowed by reminders of the pain that still lingered. For everyone involved, life had changed in ways they couldn't have imagined. For the detective, advocacy became more than just a passion. It became his purpose. He traveled across the country, speaking at conferences, community forums, and schools. His message was simple yet powerful. Accountability starts with acknowledging mistakes, and change begins when people work together. At each event, he shared his story, not to dwell on the humiliation he endured, but to highlight the importance of systemic reform. People listened intently, nodding along as he spoke about the need for empathy, respect, and transparency in law enforcement. One evening, after delivering a speech at a packed auditorium, a young man approached him. Dressed in a hoodie and sneakers, he looked nervous but determined. "I want to be a cop someday," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know if I can trust myself to do it right." The detective smiled warmly, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "That's exactly why you'll make a great one," he replied. "You're already thinking about how to do better. That's where it starts." Moments like these kept the detective going. They reminded him that his fight wasn't in vain, that every word he spoke, every workshop he led, and every conversation he had could plant seeds of change. Still, there were days when doubt crept in. Late at night, as he sat alone in his study, he wondered if the reforms taking place were enough. Would they last? Or would complacency set in once the headlines faded? These thoughts weighed heavily on him, but he refused to let them paralyze him. Instead, he focused on what he could control: his actions, his words, and his commitment to making a difference. Meanwhile, Officer Rookie's journey was far from over. After leaving the city, he moved to a small town where no one knew his name or his past. He took on odd jobs, working at a gas station, cleaning warehouses, anything to get by. Life was quiet, almost painfully so. Without the structure of the police force or the camaraderie of colleagues, he felt adrift, unsure of who he was outside of the badge he once wore. But solitude gave him time to reflect. He began reading books about racial injustice, implicit bias, and the history of policing in America. He watched documentaries, listened to podcasts, and attended online seminars. Slowly, he started to understand the scope of the problem and his role in perpetuating it. It wasn't easy. There were nights when guilt overwhelmed him, when he questioned whether he deserved a second chance. But he kept reminding himself of the detective's parting words: "Change is hard." One day, while volunteering at a local food bank, Officer Rookie struck up a conversation with an older woman sorting cans nearby. She introduced herself as a retired teacher and asked him what he did for a living. Hesitant at first, he admitted he used to be a police officer, but had made mistakes that cost him his career. To his surprise, she didn't judge him. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully and said, "Everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes. What matters is what you do next." Her words stuck with him. Over the following weeks, he threw himself into volunteer work, helping at shelters, mentoring at-risk youth, and participating in community cleanup projects. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave him a sense of purpose. For the first time in years, he felt like he was contributing something meaningful. Back in the city, the reforms implemented by Chief Monroe continued to gain traction. Officers reported feeling more equipped to handle difficult situations thanks to the new training programs. Community members noticed subtle shifts, too. Officers were more approachable, more willing to listen, and quicker to apologize when misunderstandings arose. Trust wasn't rebuilt overnight, but the cracks in the foundation were slowly being repaired. Still, challenges remained. Some officers resisted the changes, grumbling about political correctness or unnecessary bureaucracy. Others struggled to adapt, feeling lost in a system that now demanded more from them. Chief Monroe acknowledged these struggles, holding regular meetings to address concerns and offer support. She knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but she believed in the resilience of her team and the potential for growth. As the months turned into a year, the city began to feel different. Protesters still gathered occasionally, reminding everyone that vigilance was key. Activists pushed for further reforms, ensuring the momentum didn't fade. Journalists continued to investigate, shining a light on areas that needed improvement. But there was also a renewed sense of hope, a belief that real change was possible. For the detective, this hope was both inspiring and bittersweet. He often thought about the young recruits he mentored, wondering if they would carry the torch forward. He hoped they would remember the lessons he taught them, not just about procedure and protocol, but about humanity. One afternoon, as he walked through the precinct parking lot, he spotted Officer Rookie loading boxes into a moving truck. Their eyes met briefly before Officer Rookie hurried away, head bowed. It was a quiet moment, devoid of confrontation, but filled with unspoken consequences. Though the two men never crossed paths again, their lives remained intertwined by the lessons they had learned. For the detective, the journey had become less about vengeance and more about paving a better path forward, for himself, his community, and perhaps even the flawed system they all shared. And for Officer Rookie, the road to redemption was just beginning, marked by uncertainty but also the possibility of transformation. As the sun set over the city, casting golden hues across the skyline, the echoes of the past mingled with the promise of tomorrow. The fight for justice wasn't over, but it had evolved, shifting from anger to action, from division to unity. In the end, it wasn't about blame or punishment. It was about learning, growing, and striving to do better. Because sometimes, the hardest battles lead to the most meaningful victories.